Hey everybody, I'm here tonight with Robbie Wright. Thanks for joining me, Robbie.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on.
No
Uh,
worries.
so yes, this all started with our conversation in the Latter Day Lobsters group.
hmm
I don't know. Do you broadcast to a lot of people who aren't going to know that
No,
reference?
I think some will, but obviously we've interacted on Facebook, and one of the groups that I've interacted on, and I interact on quite a few, as people know. And obviously we've had some discussions back and forth about anarchism.
Yeah. So the Latter Day Lobsters group, for people who don't know, it's basically where Jordan Peterson meets LDS Mormon religion. So it's a fun group. That group's fun. You get all sorts of people.
You do.
Um, and all sorts of ideas. The Terra stuff is new to me. I've never done Terra or anything like that, but they talk about it constantly in that group, and I'm just seeing these cool pictures, and to me they're just kind of cool pictures, but they mean something to other people. But to me, I'm just like, oh, that's a cool picture. That's about as far as I go. Never known much about Terra in my life, but that's
Definitely.
that's
It's an interesting group, and there's a lot of that's kind of where I also interacted with some an LDS anarchist group online, which intrigued me because my initial thought was that anarchy was, oh, like these are members of the church that want to go and wreak chaos in the world and burn down everything, and then
yeah.
I actually got to talk with some and okay, hold on, I don't know what they're talking about when they say anarchism, and then I eventually learned and realized that you know, the name maybe throws some people off, but it's a much more interesting philosophy and one we're taking serious. And then I ended up realizing that my leanings politically, libertarian wise, very much aligned exactly with it. It's just maybe a different, kind of a more hard take on it
Yeah.
philosophically.
Well,
So,
I was a conservative for the longest time because my dad was. My dad pretty neoconservative. Um, my brother was in the Marine Corps. He's still really conservative. He was a huge Trump supporter,
mhm.
and he did 2 tours in Iraq. And my dad was very much pro Iraq war. And I basically came into libertarianism during college because I was learning economics at the time. And for me, I didn't really know much about economics in college. I just knew that I was going to get done with school quicker if I did economics versus the business school. And so I'm just like, okay, I'm going to do economics. But then I just got stupidly passionate about it. I had so many communist professors, and they radicalized me. They turned me from a conservative to a libertarian because they're just their arguments. They blew me the exact definition because I just wanted to get so far away with what they were teaching that they kind of radicalized me. And obviously, it was around that time that Ron Paul. I had just gotten back from my mission in 2011, and it started college that year, and Ron Paul was running, and that election was interesting, and so got into from there. So
Yeah,
and the
and
rest.
it's funny because I feel like that's pushed me more that way, has been sort of learning what the other side of the equation is, and so we've had some discussions about it, and I think sometimes we've had a harder time connecting. I think because of I guess I want to make sure that I'm properly representing sort of the anarchist idea. I had a conversation with Morgan about this from the group, but essentially, let me go through kind of a Steelman synopsis of sort of the anarchist point of view.
Yeah.
And I always kind of said that anarchist might be a bad marketing campaign because it does make people think of, when they think of anarchy, they think of violence and chaos, when actually violence is the exact opposite of what an anarchist wants. They want peace. They want liberty. They want people to be free from coercion from others. And
Yeah.
really, I think it starts with, as you had pointed out in your video, which you rightly pointed out. I think this all begins, and the thing that really got me, and the thing that people do not get, and it drives me absolutely nuts, is people don't understand what the state is in
Yeah.
its essence, at its
Yeah.
root. At its root, when we really take out all the pomp and circumstance and bull crap, the state is an instrument of violent force. And for anyone who doesn't understand that or believe it, and I have two of my parents are elected officials. Both my mom and dad are elected officials in the state of Nevada. And they go, just like any other legislature, king or whatever, you go in and basically they make rules. But the difference is, I mean, the church makes rules, any organization you're a part of makes rules. The difference is that in a particular geographical region where they are sovereign, essentially their rules are backed up if you don't obey them with guys with guns who show up at your house. If you're going to continue to not comply, they show up. And you realize, wait a minute, so it isn't even making of rules that separates the state from other institutions. The thing that separates it is the enforcement. It's the fact that you have violence to back it up. If the church is upset with you, they might kick you out, but they're not going to go at you with guns. And that goes pretty much for everywhere, even within your own family. You know, you can't use certain levels of violence. You can't lock your kid up in his room for 20 years and just bring him meals every day. You know, like the state won't let you do to your own family what they can do to you if you break their rules. So,
no, and that's perfect. I think where a lot of arguments come from is that people have various definitions of the state, right? And it can become difficult having conversations if you can't really decide, or not even decide, right? Because there's only one definition of the state. But if you guys can't, or just people in general, if you can't get on the same page about what the state is, right? You talk to a left-leaning person, and the state is a charitable organization, right? That's meant to redistribute income among the poorer classes from the higher classes. And you talk to a right-wing person, and they may even know that the state is violence, but they'll sometimes justify it because of defense of X, Y, or Z thing, right? So, that's usually where it happens. And Murray Rothbard wrote a book called Anatomy of the State that I recommend for anybody who's listening, because his arguments for what the state is just the best argument I've ever heard. That one really red-pilled me after, because everyone kind of starts out, usually they'll either be a conservative or a left wing, and then they kind of get into the libertarian material, and then they'll go from kind of, oh, well, I think we should have smaller government. They kind of start going into scales on how much government you should have. Mm-hmm. And then once I read Anatomy of the State, I was just like, oh, okay, well, this is it's a wrap, right?
So and that's the thing, once you understand what the state is, the question changes, because when you recognize that the essence of the state, the thing that really makes it what it is, that identifies it, is this violence, you then begin to have a conversation about when violence is justified, right? When is it okay to use violent force? But even before that, I do want to address one thing that people bring up. The most common thing I hear is, well, sort of this idea of the social contract, that, well, you're kind of, by being where you are, you have consented to that sort of it's sort of like, well, you're in America, you get the protection of the U.S. military and all the rest of it. Therefore, you have an obligation to the state, basically, that you are roped into this kind of implicit social contract. And so that's a very common one that I hear as the retort. And just want to get your thoughts on why you think that fails.
Well, just because the idea of consent isn't applied equally across the board. The only exception is given to the state, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, if you were to say, oh, a girl has entered my house, therefore she's consented to sex, that you would think that's absurd, right? Mm-hmm. Just because she came to the apartment doesn't mean she consented. It might be
even if she flirted with you and was all that, yeah,
right. So just by existing in a certain space those rules of consent don't exist for any other type of voluntary or pseudo voluntary interaction that we would have, right? So there's just no consistency with the social contract with any other context of consent. Like, we wouldn't say, oh, well, he came into this dark alley, therefore he consented to be mugged. We would find that absurd. And so, and you could do 1,000 of these different scenarios, and nobody would agree with the social contract. The only exception is given to the state, and that's because they want to justify a state.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's definitely a case of special pleading. And one aspect that I've looked at it is like, all right, well, when did I sign this contract? You know what I mean? If there's a contract is not willed upon you by someone else. You have to consent to that contract.
Right. So if you come into a restaurant, it's implied that you're going to eat there. Mm-hmm. Right. This is a place of business. So to their credit, the people who do use the social contract, there is implicit contracts, but not to the extent that we apply the social contract, right? So like, yeah, if you go into a restaurant, it's assumed that you're going to eat. But if you decided, I don't like anything on this menu, and then the restaurant didn't let you leave, right?
Yeah.
So if you restaurant and you're like, this all looks bad, I don't want any of this food, and you decide that you wanted to leave, and the restaurant's like, no, you have to order food, like that would be imprisonment, like you're kidnapped at that point, right?
Yep.
So it's just the social contract is just never applied consistently among any other context that we would apply consent rules, right?
Definitely.
And so that's just, I think that's just the biggest one and done with the social contract. It's just a lack of consistency.
I think it's definitely an interesting debate to look at. I do think that the libertarian case is much stronger, but I mean, I think you could do almost we could do an entire podcast episode about just the social contract and why that notion fails and explore all of it. So I don't I think the most important thing is just recognizing that the state is an instrument of violence, because like I was saying, once you recognize that, it colors everything, because all of a sudden the state it's making rules for if you are going to use a gun on someone, and you start thinking, well, am I willing to point a gun at someone over this thing?
Build a library, as Penn Jillette always says.
Exactly.
Willing to gun at someone to build a public library, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I could go into more things with it, and maybe I'll have to kind of re-steelman certain things as I go through sort of my blog or my kind of critique was why anarchism fails. And I did want to clarify something, that when I say that anarchism fails, I don't mean that it fails necessarily philosophically. I do believe that anarchism, I mean, it is what we want in the sense of, and maybe I'll change the word, like you were saying, to voluntarism. It's the idea that let us interact with one another voluntarily without coerced or violent coercion to make us do things, right? I think that's the right ideal. I think you'd have to be crazy not to think that, because in the ideal world, we are able to interact with one another without any sort of violence or coercion in the equation. So,
like 80%, we tend to interact peacefully. We just give ourselves these exceptions, and it's because of the amount of propaganda that's set up because of it. No, I think you're doing a great job in steel manning the position. That's exactly what and the reason that you first thought that anarchism was chaos is because that's what it's always been branded. And the first anarchists were communists, right? So there's a whole history of anarchism that has a bad branding, right? And so libertarians have attempted to rebrand it with words like volunteerism or voluntarism. I don't know. I always thought volunteerism sounds weird. It sounds like you're signing up.
Yeah.
Service project or something like that. So I don't know whether the pronunciation is volunteerism or voluntary, but the idea is that you believe in consent, and you believe it, across the board. You believe in voluntary interactions between human beings, and the state, by definition, like we discussed, is the opposite of that. So
yeah, and so this is where I kind of, and you had mentioned this in your video, is sort of the difference between sort of believing in anarchism as a principle or in voluntarism as a principle, which I do. The question is sort of like, okay, if that is where we want to go, sort of, what is the challenge to get there, and why maybe is it not always the practical solution, or is it not possible? And so with that, I'll go into some of my thoughts about that. And the first one that comes up is, and you had brought it up yourself in your video response, was sort of this idea of what if, like, voluntarism is peace, right? It's people freely interacting. But what do you do when people don't want peace? What do you do with those people within your society who want to steal, who want to rob, who want to form ideological mobs of communist types or whatever, who want to use either their collective power to control other people? Because I think that is a very real human impulse. Yeah.
Well, so there's kind of, and this probably would have been better had we started off at that point, because I think that's where you were coming from. It's just that some of the presupposition, I think I'm saying that right,
Uh-huh.
in the first paragraphs that I read, I don't think were as clear to me at the time, whether I read them wrong or whether they were written incorrectly. Maybe I just didn't understand them correctly. But basically, the idea, like philosophically, like you said, voluntarism, anarchism, anarcho-capitalism, right? It makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
and it's almost too difficult to disagree with, based on just by definition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're a peaceful person. Now, some alt-right people are like, no, we understand that the state is violence and we're okay using it against our enemies.
Yeah.
And
which frankly is sort of, and that's almost to some extent the point of my of my blog, and maybe this is a valid critique of what I'm thinking. Is my thought is okay, maybe the state could be necessary to be able to prevent people from using violent force against others, but the state in and of itself is a violent entity, and so therefore you can have people who can take over that entity and utilize it for that purpose. And ultimately that's, I mean, the way I kind of see it is we live in a world of limited resources where people are kind of competing for those resources. And one of the resources that kind of is at the heart of the reason that I think that the state forms and has formed over and over and over in societies is it has to do with the fact that there's a geographical region in question, right? Land, ownership. I came to a very interesting conclusion as I was thinking about this and really kind of going through the anarchist sort of point of view. And I realized one major challenge that we face is that the land that we own, like me, I'm a property owner. I own the house that I have here. I don't really own it. I think I do. I say I do. I have a little certificate from the state that says that I own it, but I own it at their will and pleasure, because if I don't pay my taxes to them, my rent to the state, they'll take it from me. So who really owns the land? Now I can say, yeah, maybe on a moral level, someone could say that I own it, but these, if you take a virgin piece of territory, like the one where I live right now, originally it was just, nobody really had a claim to it, but then people came in and made claims. And then eventually who really owns it is whoever claims it and is willing to back it with violent force. They say, possession is 9/10 of the law. Well, at the end of the day, do I really own it if someone can come and take it from me? I mean, morally maybe, but practically not really.
Well, what's interesting is you're not far off from the communist argument against property rights as well, right? So that's what the anarcho-communists argue, right? They say rent is theft because the only way that you can make claim on property is through violence, right? And that's not necessarily the case. It's basically the chicken and the egg have reversed positions within the natural rights or the natural property rights argument. Right. So kind of the Lockean argument. Right. So if there's land that's not being used. Right. And then you go and insert your labor in that land and you create a fence, and of course, you may have to defend it against people who would want to do you ill will. But if you have inserted your individual labor into that, you've then made claim. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The claim ultimately is a claim is legitimized morally by you inserting your labor into it. Someone can come and claim, like if you have two people who claim the land, but one person has spent 20 years building it into this beautiful farm and that's really productive and makes the world better, and then some guy's just like, no, that's mine. We morally all can reason to that. No, the person who owns the land is the one who has actually put their labor into it, improved it, yada yada.
Well, and the reason we have to do that philosophically, because the alternative is to justify slavery. Right. And
how so?
Well, the alternative would be to justify slavery in that if I insert my labor into a piece of land and someone can just make a moral claim that it is now theirs, they have philosophically made me their slave.
Yeah.
I built land, construed, and if they can just extract that from me, whether by violence or some moral claim, they've justified slavery. right? Because I've already inserted my labor in there, and if anyone can just take it, then you've made a philosophical claim that slavery is perfectly okay, which nobody actually wants to do, because deep down inside we know that it's not okay to steal the time and the labor of someone else.
See, and that's where, again, I think in my blog I kind of look into this, is sort of this idea of an appeal to morals and to sort of these higher rational ideals of property rights and natural rights. And I think you're totally right. Like, I agree 100%. Like, yes, sir.
Yeah.
All on board, 100%. And then the Vikings show up.
It's a moral principle. The non-aggression principle is a moral principle.
And
sorry, I didn't.
No, you're fine. And I agree with it. That is the right principle. And I would say the non-aggression principle, and maybe this could be debated, but I think it really does in the West come out of that Judeo-Christian tradition that inculcated that deeply into Western culture, that we all kind of just implicitly accept that that's okay. When you actually look at history, that's not the case. Okay.
Right.
In history, it was the ethic was conquest. It was not, democratic reason and cooperation. It was, we're bigger, we're stronger, we'll take the land and it's ours. And I guess, that's where I sort of find the anarchist sort of ideal that maybe we're working towards not possible when you're surrounded by Vikings. You need to have some way of protecting oneself. Now, I wrote a second blog. So the first one was just kind of a steel man of the argument. The second was sort of an exploration of how anarchists have proposed that systems can naturally arise within a society, even like our own, to solve problems like aggression by others, where there's a formulation of you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Sorry about that.
No worries. No worries. It's all good.
I don't know who this late, but sorry.
So anyway, the basic thought though is that I consider myself more of a minarchist, or minimal government, right? I want to try and minimize the state as much as possible, with the hope that maybe at some point we could truly live in a stateless society. I think that's sort of, in my kind of estimation, I think that's what Zion is. It's a society where people are all voluntarily taking care of one another and living in love and harmony and all of that. But I just look at, okay, I don't know that the solutions that are proposed by anarcho-capitalists, for instance, or anarcho-communists for another, I don't find those solutions. I have serious doubts about them because of the state of human beings. I think they require a level of reason, a level of morality that I don't necessarily think we've achieved to be able to go there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that's an interesting line of reason. So the only pushback I would have against that, right, is that if you say, hey, to do my best in how I understand your argument, and let me know where I mess up in that. Effectively, it becomes similar to arguments that libertarians have dealt with, where it's like, well, we're just not in a position where we can have that type of society. We need a state because there are Vikings at the border. There's this and this and this. But the non-aggression principle as a moral principle doesn't say that you can't use force, right? There's a pacifist version that's kind of its own thing, but the non-aggression principle in and of itself justifies the use of force, in self-defense. Mm-hmm. The issue is that if you think self-defense requires you to then initiate force on other people in order to collect the funds to create this force, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Then you're getting an illogical consistency in that you're saying, oh, well, in order to defend ourselves from these Vikings who are horrible, we have to go be Vikings.
Yeah, we have to go point our gun at innocent people and extract money from them.
Exactly. So I mean, because there is two sides of the argument. There's the philosophy, which you've already said, yeah, obviously this makes sense because we understand the definition of the state. The state is violence. I am pro-peace. Therefore, I want the end of the state.
Yep.
Now, I think your question about your question of like shrugging your shoulders, like, I don't know how to get there. I think that's honest, right? I think too many libertarians pretend to think that that they know, they have all the answers. There's plenty of people who do have some great solutions, who do have some great ideas.
Yeah.
But I think any one libertarian saying, "Oh, I know how to get to a free state tomorrow," was it just ridiculously unhumble and just probably wrong.
It's kind of like someone saying that they know how to set up the economy perfectly, right? It's like that's kind of the genius of sort of the libertarian idea, is that no one assumes that they know everything. We kind of let everybody sort it out. And I think that so you brought up a very good point. I want to make sure I understand it and give it back to you. Is sort of this idea of, okay, you want to prevent the use of violence, force against other. That's one of the reasons that we have to, the justification behind creating a state, like saying Vikings at the door, or just internal conflict within a geographical region. So we're going to set up a state to make the rules so that people aren't stealing from each other, doing whatever. But in order to fund that state, you have to collect taxes. And in order to collect taxes, you have guns pointing at people. And now it's like, wait a minute, you're becoming part of the problem here. And then there's all the problems with the corruption of the state, where the violent actors and the bad actors insert themselves into the state to take advantage of the violent power of the state to get what they want. Totally agree. This is, and I think that go ahead.
Just for a second, let's give the argument at Steele, and let's say that these people aren't corrupt, that they're perfect people. But by definition, they have to create an organization of violence to then fund themselves, right?
Yeah.
Because if we did have a defense force that was entirely voluntary, it wouldn't be a state by definition.
Yeah.
Right. So if we're paying quote unquote mercenaries to be like, hey, these Vikings are trying to kill us all, go out and protect our land, right? That's not a state. That's a security force, right? And we have that difference, right? So in our current environment, that's not hard to think about because that already exists. And I remember reading somewhere that like over something like 30 or 40% of security forces in the US are private. Mm-hmm. So that already exists, right? There's already private security forces that exist. So it's not hard to think of. But the difference is that if you argue, hey, well, we need this state because there's violence out there. There's people that want violence and they want to attack us. But then we have to then become the thing that we're trying to defend ourselves from. It's like the Batman quote, right? You live long enough to see yourself become the enemy. That's in essence what you're doing, both philosophically and really, right? Because you're going to have to go to grandma's house. You're going to have to be the sheriff of Nottingham, and you're going to have to bat on her door and be like, nope, taxes for the king, because the king needs his army, right? Yeah. So
and I think that to some extent is where maybe we get to the point where our difference probably lies. Because I think our difference probably lies in our willingness to justify utilizing the state for what I think the let's call it the free market, the anarchist solution, the just leave people alone solution can't resolve, right? That there may be things that I think are, and while I want to make those things as that list of things that I don't think can be done without a state as small as possible, it's sort of I believe they exist. And that's why I consider myself a minarchist, because I just don't think that we are at the point that I think that these systems would naturally work themselves out. I do think that, but I'm also open here. I mean, this isn't something that I'm totally set on. Now, just I obviously have a big American flag on the wall behind me, which is something that for, your typical anarchists are like, and really mad about it. I have, so I consider myself to be a patriotic American. Okay. I consider myself that way. And I consider myself, my idea is that I want to preserve the principles of the American founding, because ultimately I believe that they are rooted in sort of these anarchist principles, in these ideas that the state is meant to be minimized, that we would try and rid ourselves of that. So the reason that I am not a fan of the U.S. government, the U.S. government is a coercive force that is off the rails 90% of the time. But when I think of America and sort of my patriotism is rooted in these ideals of life, liberty, property, and the way I see it is I see the United States and its charter as sort of we want to make people free. We want to get rid of coercion and violence. We want peace. And these are the principles by which we should establish ourselves. And we're going to, as a people, though we're not there yet, we want to work towards that. And therefore, we're going to set up a system with as limited a government as possible. And then sadly, I think that the story of and this is the reason I consider myself a conservative, because what I am conserving is sort of that original vision that now has been totally bastardized into basically a nanny state, just heading farther and farther towards, full-on socialist dystopia.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's kind of an element of autism within libertarian persons, right? So when they see the American flag, their first instinct is to be like, oh, that represents an empire, right? But to a lot of people, those representations are a little bit different, and they've been bastardized by a government that's been horrible, right?
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, there's a lot of tradition in there, just like the Confederate flag, it means something to a lot of people as well.
Mm-hmm.
And although it means something else to an entirely different group as well, and can offend other groups, like, they carry different meanings for different people, and that's based on context and history. So to just like dismiss something so I get exactly where you're coming from, is the kind of the long and short of it. So I served my mission in Brazil, and when people wave a Brazilian flag, they're not like, hey, we love our government so much.
Same thing with Argentina. That's where I served.
Yeah, it's like this earth that we came into, right? And our football team and all that stuff. There's lots of different things that represent a nation. 1776 was the greatest human experiment. It really was. And a lot of governments, it's not for naught that a lot of governments recreated their constitution after what was done in 1776. It was the greatest rejection of monarchy. It was the greatest rejection of how the status quo, right?
Yeah, and the state in those eras was the systems now have decentralized, which is, in my estimation, a step towards what anarchism wants. Anarchism is the ultimate decentralization.
Correct.
It's centralizing it in each individual's life, rather than in any central group. And so I look at that move towards decentralization as a positive move. Where I get caught up and where I struggle is, what's funny is I'm really conflicted, because sometimes I'm like, I hate democracy. Like, and I think that, I go back to kind of the Plato's ideas about it. Plato did not like democracy because he recognized that, most people can be swayed into doing absolutely awful things. And so it's sort of one of these things, is liberty is something it's the right thing for everyone, but kind of like even with your children. And I don't want this to come off as elitist. I don't think I'm better than everybody. There's wonderful people out there, but with, you don't give your children liberty. You kind of control them. And the thing is that I think, and this is politically incorrect, but I think that there is a large amount of people out there, the masses, that just can be easily swayed to do awful things. And so if you give people liberty, and the more you ease off any of these sort of institutional controls or whatever they may be, religion, these don't even have to be the state. They just are kind of that social fabric that keeps people behaving well towards one another. Because at the end of the day, if a group of people don't know how to self-govern, they don't want peace, they want to take their neighbor's stuff all the time. If you expand that out, as society gets worse and worse, in my estimation, there becomes more of a need, hopefully, for private institutions to cure that. But as a last stand, I do see that violent force to protect people from violent force is something that's legitimate, even if it requires the extraction of taxation in order to create that social cohesion, because I would prefer a dictator that keeps us safe from mobs of just unruly people that can't handle liberty, that are literally killing and stealing, and it's just all over the place. I would rather have a dictator than total murderous chaos.
Yeah.
You know? And most people do. I think that's literally the reason why the state has formed in geographical region, is because there was a need in a particular geographical region to say, we don't like it the way it is, because people, especially a long time ago, were not able to handle being just totally left alone because they steal from each other and do bad things.
Yeah. So I guess first off, I want to apologize by claiming that you didn't do your homework, because you've done a lot of homework. And you should be proud of that. And usually one of the things that we joke about in libertarian community is we always ask the question, what's the difference between an anarchist and a minarchist? 3 months, right? you're just holding on to certain things because, and I was that way too when I was a conservative. Like I was holding on to, oh gosh, I held on to, I don't know. I was holding on to, the empire for the longest time, just because, my brother was a Marine. Right. And his sacrifice had to mean something, right? Like it had, there's a reason that he would write letters saying that he got shelled and he would lose friends, and like that had to mean something. Right. And so, I held on to that for way too long. Right. And so that's kind of where you're at. The thing is that, where I was when I was kind of in your phase, not to kind of pull the old, well, back in my day when I was,
it's all right. You can go there.
I just remember feeling what you're feeling, right? I remember feeling those feelings of like, well, there has to be something there, right? But you kind of have to bring it right back to the definition, right? So if you are going to have a state, that state is going to initiate violence, and that state is already chaos. Right, that already is violence, and that already is chaos.
So let me push back on that just for a sec. So I do definitely get the objection of you're using violence to stop violence. Essentially, you're extorting money from others to stop violence, and maybe this is where my I guess maybe I'm more utilitarian just in my moral outlook. Is that I look at it and I say, look. If I have to extort money from people, property. And this is largely where I'm going to go. And I think this is probably at the core of it, beyond any feelings or attachment to the state. Philosophically, this is where the rubber really hits the road for me. Property, in my mind. So I don't take all rights and put them on an equal playing field. I think that certain rights, which are entitlements in my mind, that people are entitled to. So your life, you are entitled to it. Your liberty, you are entitled to that. Okay? So my belief is that property is lower on the hierarchy of rights than life itself. In other words, I believe morally, and this is where there may just be a fundamental disagreement where you say it's tomato, tomato, and we don't agree. And this happens with, I've had this with others. But this idea of, if my child is starving and I have another person there owns a bakery and they have plenty of bread, they're not going to starve, and I go and steal a loaf of bread to save my child's life, I am justified in doing that because my child is more entitled to his life than that baker is to his bread. Now that may be where the line is, where people are just like, yeah, I just disagree with that. But granting that premise, if I grant that premise, and if someone does just for the sake of argument, I think there is a coherent argument that you can make to say, look, if our lives as a community are threatened, we are justified in creating an institution that will take your property from you in order to protect all of our lives, because our lives that matter more than that, more than property. It's the same reason that I believe that acute medical care for someone I don't have a problem with that being like, if my kid is dying and you have the cure in their house, you have plenty of it, and I go and take it from you, it's sort of like, I think that's justified. And so it does open the window of taxation in my mind but it only opens the window of taxation. There's a limiting principle on it. It only opens the window of taxation insofar as the services being rendered can be attached to life, that it actually is life-sustaining, rather than, we think that these people deserve your money more than you do. That's bullcrap. Obviously, we're on the same page there. So it creates, I think, a framework for a minarchist philosophy that can justify the taking of property in the pursuit of the protection of any right that is greater in value than the property that is taken. Yeah. That's where I philosophically try and undergird this. And ultimately, if property is indeed the same value as life or more valuable than life or whatever, then this argument falls apart. I simply, as a premise, believe philosophically that to be the case, and it's very, very, it's kind of a tomato thing. I don't know that it's...
Yeah. So you've got 3 months to work this out, and then you'll be coming in. And no. So, yeah. So, I mean, from a property rights perspective, right? Mm-hmm. The only property rights are self-ownership and what you apply your self-ownership to, right? So when you were talking about, I don't hold rights, I rank rights by priority, right? In essence, I think is what you're kind of saying.
I believe in a hierarchy of rights. I don't believe that all rights are equal, because I think that rights can come into conflict. A person's right to their property and someone's right to their life, they can be in conflict. And if you're watching as an outside observer, you say, which right takes precedence, his kid's life or the baker's bread?
Yeah. So that's definitely where we would disagree, because rights is kind of a misnomer in terms of when you get into kind of natural rights theory, right? Because there's not like free speech isn't a right, free, like all the types of things that we associate with the Bill of Rights, those are kind of just extensions of the core right, which is a right to your life, right? That is the core right, is the life to your life, or right to your life, and everything is an extension to that, right? So for using your example of the baker has used his life,
his time and labor.
We got 100 years, right? He's used his time and labor in creating that bakery, right? So you may feel justified because your son is going to die without that bread, but you are taking from him something that he has given. You're taking, proverbially, you're taking his life, not the whole thing, but you're taking moments or seconds of that life that he put into this bakery. Okay. Now, you may be perfectly willing to violate your philosophical morality for the sake of saving your son, because you love your son more than the baker, right?
Yeah.
So you haven't necessarily wrecked the philosophy. You've just confessed that my son's about to die. Who the hell cares about morality? I want him to live because I love him more, right? But you haven't necessarily rejected that it's wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and I can see what you're saying there. So just again to kind of steelman back what you're saying, it's this idea that let's just use property and life, because those are the two rights that we're dealing with right here, which are kind of the big core ones but you're saying that they essentially are the same thing, because the property that you're created was created with your life. So I'm taking, in essence, a portion of his life and giving that so that my son can have his portion of life. And all I'm doing is prioritizing one person's life over another person's life. Fair enough. I can see that.
You're not saying that it's not, I robbed from the baker to save my son, and I was wrong to do it. But it's because I love my son and I value him more. So basically, you're not wrecking the philosophy. The philosophy is still intact. You still believe that ideally this society should exist in which we don't steal the life of another. You're just making an exception because of someone that you love, right? And so a lot of people will do this to the extent of the state, right? Mm-hmm. And so, sorry.
You're fine.
Yeah. But we may have to wrap up here soon. I think my wife wants me to.
No, you're fine. I think we've hit a lot of the ground I wanted to cover anyway.
But in essence, that's where I think that that you'll kind of work through some things, because once you realize that basically the core property right is your life and everything is just an extension and a branch from that,
mm-hmm.
you start to realize that, oh, okay, well, I may want to save my son by stealing the baker's bread. And you'll come into lots of these arguments that are constantly made to supposedly wreck the philosophy, right? You'll start to realize, oh, okay, I've just decided that his minutes of making bread aren't worth the entirety of my son's life and potential.
And I think that may get to where, and ultimately maybe I'll have to continue to look through that. But at least now I think I've narrowed it down to at least where the issue is to really explore. Because at the end of the day, like you're saying, I may look at it and say, well, I don't care. The value of life, in my view, may not be totally equal. And I would say that is something that most human beings naturally just feel, is that, look, the value of certain groups of people are higher in value than others. And we are ultimately, if we are in competition with one another in this world, then I'm going to do what I can to make sure that the life of those that I care about comes before the life of others. Or, in this case, and I think, and again, theoretically, I can see what you're saying as, you're taking from his life to give to his. I may say, yeah, but the return on taking 2 minutes of the baker's time to keep my son alive, or if this were a medical thing, the cure that, and it took him 10 minutes to make the pill versus the entire life of my child. I've exponentially grown life. I've saved someone that I love, and again, I don't know that I'm not necessarily saying that my philosophy on sort of the hierarchy of rights is necessarily correct, because I think that's a valid critique. But I also can still say there's a moral intuition there that I think should be fleshed out, because I do think that there still can be cases made to where someone's property, which represents a smaller portion of their life, can be less valuable than someone else's, and which has a bigger effect.
Yeah, and I think that they would probably agree, right? The baker would probably be like, yeah, pay me when you get the chance, right?
Yeah.
So there's a human decency that comes with that, and I think
and maybe that's one of the challenges, is there is somewhat of an assumption of human decency that is required in this whole equation. Because if people were, and again, this is obviously theoretical, but the idea being, if the baker is 100% stingy, like he's like, no, you're not getting any of my bread. I'm not giving anything to your kid. He can die. I don't care. Obviously people are better than that, but it does show that within this equation of making this work, there's a necessary component of good. And I actually relate that back, with us sharing the same religious beliefs, to sort of this idea of Zion. The state becomes totally unnecessary. When that goodness grows to its greatest level, the state no longer is relevant. And so that's kind of where I see sort of to kind of take this whole conversation, maybe, and just kind of at the end here, we'll tilt it a little bit in the direction of a religious context. That's kind of what I think we're doing in the church, is we're trying to basically make people anarchists in the sense that we can trust them with we can trust them with full-blown liberty, because they will use that liberty to seek virtue and to bless one another and to help one another, rather even in an environment of limited resources.
Yeah, and so as far as the kind of limited resources argument, I don't think you're using it in a way that's normally used. And so when you were going off on it in the other paragraph in the Why Anarchism Fails, I probably jumped the gun. And to be fair, a lot of libertarians do that just because there's a lot of these recycled arguments that we just hear constantly.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
Using it in a different context that I still disagree with, but it's at least more enlightened than like, well, there's limited resources, therefore we have to have a state. And it's like, the state is the worst with limited resources.
Yes.
Like first of all, it's just empirically worse with limited resources, right? But anywho, so yeah, I think that I mean, obviously, yes, if the baker was super stingy and was like, no, your kid can just die, I mean, it's his life, right? And you just have to be willing to be violent to take that bread.
Yeah.
But you still have to recognize that you are being violent.
Yeah.
And your violence is probably not justified. It's just that you're willing to do it, right? And if the baker killed you in your attempt to steal his bread, he would have been justified morally.
Yeah.
Because you were being violent towards him and taking of his property, which is just an extension of his life, right? Now, obviously, this scenario is to the most absurd, but sometimes you have to.
I think they're good for illustrating the principle, right?
Exactly.
Extremes help us to understand what principle is in play. And in my mind, I think that there is a lot of moral calculation there. And I never was intending on this conversation was, we're going to resolve all this and have it come to a perfect meeting of the minds. But I definitely think, at least if nothing else, I think this has been a productive conversation in that we have been able to clarify some things and I always say this, I would rather understand where we disagree rather than agree. Because then you end up finding where the fundamental differences are. And a lot of times they're much, like as we've kind of gone through here, they're much smaller than we think they are.
This is literally micro disagreement. Yeah. It's literally, we disagree on whether there exists the right to life and the right to property or whether they're the same. Right. Like that's such a, you're like 3 months away from being like, oh yeah, it's the same. It's the same because
that'll have to be another subject of study and writing or something for me is to go through that exploration, and maybe I'll frustrate the hell out of you because I come up with very different conclusions. But I do appreciate any time that I can spend some time to hash through these issues with someone else, because those who are watching who don't even know what anarchism is hopefully now have a much better idea of what the conversation actually is, and why it makes sense. And hopefully for me, I've been able to go and find another area that myself that I can kind of look into to further kind of flesh out sort of my view on rights and how my moral compass kind of integrates with it. So,
so Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State.
Okay.
If you haven't read that, it's not a big read. You can listen to it. Mises.org has the audio for free.
See, I listened. There were 2 books that I had read from. Trying to remember, one of them was, I don't know if it was Anatomy of the State. One of them was by not Milton Friedman, but I think his son has a book.
David Friedman. Market Anarchism is one of I think his book is, maybe it's not called Market Anarchism, but he's a market anarchist.
Well, I gotta remember which one it was. Anyway, I'll have to let you know. But there are 2 good books that actually it was Morgan who had suggested them to me, and so I took some time to really read them, flesh them out. But you're saying Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard is a must read.
That was my red pill. Was my red pill. Because literally once I understood what the state is, once I heard his arguments about what the state is, I can't find myself defending the state.
Yeah.
Right. And even if you're a minarchist to the degree where you feel like you have a separation between right to life and right to property, and you want to rank those, like, this is like, we're on the same team. Like, we're
that's why I always tell people,
patch on the left shoulder that's a little bit different than mine. We're wearing the same uniform.
The libertarians won't come and get me when the revolution starts. They won't throw me in. I'm hoping I end up. I always told people this. I actually told my parents this today. I'm like, if the revolution comes and I don't get thrown in the gulag first, I have not done my job.
Well, there were a couple points where you were making some similar communist anarchists. So who knows? Just tell them that you think that rent is theft, and they won't throw you.
They'll leave me alone. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for taking the time tonight and coming on chatting with me. It's been a good chat.
Absolutely. Happy to do it anytime, man. We can coordinate. I know you're West Coast and I'm East Coast, but
yeah.
So that makes time difference here. It's midnight here, and you're just getting ready to go to bed now. But it's fun, man. We'll have to do it again.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much for coming on, bud. Take care.
Yeah, good one, Jake.
Bye-bye.